So good morning. I'm Ian. We've got Jenn and Finn here as well. And thanks for joining us live on the Circle community. We're still figuring out this system and seeing what works and what doesn't work. So if at any time you're having trouble with the feed or anything's not working right, just put it in the chat and we should be able to see that. This week we're going to be covering photography. And also, if audio levels aren't working or if you're having trouble hearing us, please let us know right away. So I've got chat on my laptop, so I should be able to see that as well. This week we're covering photography with drones. We're back to basics, and we're going to be starting with the fundamentals of photography. So quickly, why you should listen to us. It's a little bit of background. I have been around cameras my entire life. My first camera was a Sony video camera in 1988 that my dad spent way too much money on and got in a lot of trouble. And so we shot pretty much everything with that, and it was all terrible and garbage and useless. But it was my first experience. Through high school, I've had various interests in photography and messed around with cameras. I've always been shooting something. And I was really fortunate that my mom taught photography in high school for almost 40, 50 years. And I ended up going to university and taking a darkroom black and white and color analog and digital photography with a focus on still photography. So my expertise is in technical aspects of photography, like playing with low light exposure, long exposure, night landscapes. I'm really passionate about making images as high quality as possible. So I really focus on the technical aspects. I've been fortunate to have some work published. I had a photo published in a helicopter magazine. I've sold photos. It's never been my day job, but it's always been my passion. And so somehow that ended up ending in the world of coastal drone, and drones are flying cameras. So it's a pretty sweet gig. So let's talk about that, and then we'll kind of work into what the composition and the other sides of it is. And I'll let you guys also share your experience with photography. So Jenn, what's your level of knowledge of photography? We've got a real mix here today, I think.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty new to photography. I mean, grew up with almost phones in our hands our whole lives, so I guess there's that level of it, but definitely not something that I gravitate towards, but definitely interesting, of course, and I do love what is able to be done with photography and with photos, so it's always interesting to see, but I would say I'm very, very basic beginner level.
Sweet.
Absolutely.
Well, that's good, right? We want to get all aspects because, like I said, I'm very technical, so go ahead, Finn.
Yeah, I kind of am in the middle. I kind of represent the advanced amateur, I'd say. So I have had photos published in a gallery, and I've had things like that done. My mother was also is also a professional photographer, so I've got some of that experience, but I have had no formal training. So from a technical aspect, I don't have that kind of technical training that Ian does. So it's kind of the full range, because you've got Ian who has all of the university grade knowledge, Jenn's the beginner, and then me, I just take 2 photos and then pick the one that looks best.
What are you talking about? I take 10.
And they all look terrible.
Yeah, I'll just tell you this. I work at a restaurant part-time as well, and a group of ladies asked me to take a photo for them. I took a couple, they looked at them, and then grabbed the next person to take another round of photos for them because they said it wasn't good.
You are technically a professional photographer. Yeah. You're getting paid, and you take photography.
Okay,
photos.
See, I like that. Yeah, let's live in that delusional
Doesn't
world.
matter, it got paid. That's all that matters.
All right, then they sourced it somewhere else.
Yeah. So one of the technical limitations with this circle room is the video feed comes through a little bit small on the live, but we are recording this as well, and we'll make this a VOD, and we'll mix it so that talking head portions are a little easier to see when we've got stuff going on down the road. But so I'm going to bring up the screen share right now, so you will see that coming up. And I got to remember to look at the camera instead of look at my screen so that I'm not just scowling the entire time. So let me get the screen share going here again. Audience window. No. Where did it go? There it is. And that'll get rid of the crazy infinity wall as well. So there we go. Okay, drone photography. So another AI image generated, but I'm loving it. Some of them are terrible, some of them are great, but honestly, I have fully embraced DALL-E into my daily workflow for image creation. You'll see if you can spot the ones that are AI versus real throughout this. Shouldn't be hard. So today we're talking about photography. So first section is going to be camera basics and exposure. We're going to get into the science of photography a little bit, and we're going to talk about what makes an image and kind of the technical aspects of it first. And then we're going to bring it back to drones and composition and why you got to remember that drones are just flying cameras. So first thing to understand about photography is how to use light. Good lighting is key to taking great photos. It's also all about how much light is captured and how it illuminates the subject. It's important to learn about the camera settings, which we're going to do next, like aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So these are going to control how much light enters the camera and how your image works. Remember that cameras are just photon capture buckets, right? They just bring light into them and capture it in certain ways. And all we're doing is managing how that light gets onto the camera and how the image is created and painted with it. So we're going to first talk about the first part of a camera, the lens. So on the slide, we've got two different typical lenses. On the left side, we've got a telephoto lens, which is roughly 200 millimeter. It's used for magnifying or enlarging things that are farther away, and it's going to have a narrower field of view. So you're only going to see a small portion of a vista or a scene that you would see with your eyes. On the right side, we've got a wide-angle lens, which has a shorter focal length. So the length from the front of the lens to the back or where the image is only 24 millimeters long, but it's physically wider. It's a wider image, and it's got a wider field of view. It's almost 170 degrees. Both of these lenses are for the same size camera. They both project the same size image circle, which is the light that's focused on the back side of the lens, which hits the sensor or the strip of film if you're using a film camera. Both of these lenses also have what are called or considered large apertures, which is what we're going to talk about next. An aperture is the opening at the front of the camera and how much light gets through the camera. So what the heck is aperture? Aperture refers to the size of the opening in the lens that lets light into the camera. It's measured in f-stops like 5.6, f4, and I'm just going to double check, make sure there's no notes for chat. Like I said, leave something in the chat if something comes up throughout this. F5.6, like you can see on the left here, or f4, 2.8, or f8, etc. A lower f-stop means that there is a larger opening for more light, which is great in low light situations. It's going to let more light or photons or rays into the camera. It also, at the same time, though, creates a shallow depth of field, which makes the background behind a subject that's in focus blurry, right? So you'll have your subject that's in focus and then everything behind it will be blurry. If you use a higher f-stop number, you've got a smaller opening or a narrower aperture, which means there's less light getting through the camera because it's a more focused, a tinier hole, and it's going to have a deeper depth of field because now all the rays behind it and all the are getting through sharply. So if you're in focus here, stuff behind it will also be in focus farther back, so it's not going to be blurry behind it. So smaller aperture, less light, more things in focus. Larger aperture, more light, but less things in focus. Right now we're just talking about light, but it's something that's critical to remember. Not as much in drones though. So we're talking about light. Light is measured in standard units, and there's a couple different ways to think about it. In digital camera world, it's called exposure value, and it's also known as stops or as full standard units. The higher the EV, the more, or exposure value, the more light that is entering the camera, resulting in a brighter photo. Conversely, a lower EV means less light and a darker photo. Exposure value adjustments can be done manually or they'll automatically be done by the camera. So it's a core concept that we've got to cover here. By default, a camera, if you just whip up your phone and it's in full auto, its job is to figure out all the camera settings and get to a value of 0 EV or 0 exposure value adjustment. What it's doing is it's actually looking to target the equivalent of something that looks like it's a 15 or 18% gray sheet of paper. So when you're looking at a sheet of paper, the value isn't pure white, it isn't pure black, it's somewhere about 18% gray. That's what the light sensor is designed to look for. And then from there, you can adjust your settings to go higher or lower. On this chart here, we've got 0 AV in the middle, and assuming that the camera was using f5.6 aperture, so somewhere that's usually considered about middle of the road for a sensor or a camera lens, that aperture can be opened or closed to let more light in or less light in. If it's letting more in, it's going to be going to f4, 2.8, 2, 1.4, and it's going to be moving on the left side of this graph here, and you'll see the +1, +2, +3, +4 exposure value. So that f4 to that f2.8 represents a one-stop jump or a one exposure value increase, right? So that's where the +1, +2, and vice versa with the -1, -2, okay? So when we look down here at this is a DJI drone exposure indicator in manual mode where the M is, that's saying +0.7. That means that image, as far as the sensor is seeing it right now, it thinks it's going to be overexposed beyond 18% gray by 3/4 of a full stop is what the +0.7 means. So it's slightly overexposed. And so we talked about aperture and lenses. Here's a quick chart of all the drones that are pretty much available on the market right now from DJI only. No other brands are mentioned right now, but and on the left side of this chart are all the drones that have fixed aperture lenses. On the right side are drones that have variable aperture lenses. And we're talking about being able to control your aperture as a way to control light. Now, not being able to control your aperture isn't the end of the world in a drone because you're dealing with a wide angle lens. And a wide angle lens won't have, we talked earlier about depth of field. If you have a wide aperture on a wide angle lens, unless you're holding your drone like here, trying to take a picture of something here, everything behind it is still going to be sharp, even at f2.8, up at 50 feet in the sky, because of focus distance and a whole bunch of other deep dive math that we're not going to get into. But basically, it's called a hyperfocal distance. And at a certain point, everything's in focus when you focus at a distance. And on wide angle lenses, it's actually relatively close to you. Like me to fin is probably the hyperfocal distance for the Mavic 3, right? So everything would be in focus regardless of the aperture. But if I use that 200 mil lens and get fin, fin would have to be 300 feet away for it to be the hyperfocal distance of the lens. It's basically going to be different. So aperture doesn't matter in terms of composition and image storytelling, but where it does matter is light. And we'll get into that at the end of this, how you fix that. But one of the important things to note is the Mavic 2 Zoom doesn't have a variable aperture on the zoom. It's actually fixed. The barrel of the lens moves back and forth, but the aperture is not adjustable. So it's kind of an interesting thing I hadn't realized until I looked this up last night. So all the pro cameras have variable apertures, which is one of the things that sets them apart from entry-level cameras, is having the ability to adjust your aperture so that you don't need to land and change ND filters or change the sunglasses in front of the lens, which would be another way to cut the amount of light coming in and out. So not being able to control aperture means you now have a constraint or a constant in your exposure, and we're going to talk more about that. So finally, let's talk about the sensor. The sensor brings up things like image quality and noise. So larger sensors have a more surface area for more light to hit, leading to less noise. However, the size of the image circle must also be bigger with a bigger sensor, which means bigger lenses, which means heavier cameras, which means bigger drones. So this is relatively to scale. And on the left is the Inspire 3 with the full frame 35 millimeter sensor, which is a 24 by 36 millimeter sensor. And on the far right is the Mini 1, 2, the Mavic Original Pro, the Mavic Air, the 2 Zoom, which is a Pro $2,500 drone. It's got a very tiny sensor, and the Spark. And it's running a 1/2.3 inch sensor. So it's a crop sensor. And of course, the advantage of that is you can get a very lightweight, very tiny drone, but you are going to suffer in terms of image quality, because now to get the same, let's say all of these were 12 megapixel sensors. That means that the pixels have to be smaller, right? The micron spacing between the pixels is tighter and tighter and tighter as the sensors get smaller. So miniaturization, the smaller your wires get, the more sensitive they are to noise. The more noise you get, as you increase your sensitivity, which we're going to talk about now, you get more picture noise, right? So ISO, or sensor sensitivity, measures, basically ISO is the measurement of camera sensitivity to light. A low ISO, like 100 or 200, is less sensitive and requires more light to be given to it, which means either wider aperture or longer shutter speed. It's ideal for bright conditions. So on a sunny day, you're going to want to run a low ISO, but on a dark day, you're going to want to run a high ISO. So high ISO, like 1600, 3200, or all the way up and beyond now. Like camera technology is just getting crazy. Like 200,000 ISO on the newest sensors is not a big deal, but you pay for that. It's going to cause more grain and noise, like the image on the right side here. So these are both the exact same photo. They were both raw. The original was captured at 2000 ISO. And then the right side, I pushed it to simulate 200,000 ISO, and you see all the noise in the image, right? So all these lines in this crosshatch pattern, that's coming from the microscopic wires on the back of the sensor being pumped up, like they're being amplified with higher voltage in order to grab more photons or more light energy and convert it into electricity. So just like when you turn up your car subwoofer to 11 and you get more noise and you get music, if you crank up the amplifiers on the back of a camera sensor, it's going to create more noise on the sensor. Now, again, like there's technology coming out that makes this kind of irrelevant, but it's always like garbage in, garbage out. If you start with a really high ISO setting on a camera, you're going to start with a garbage photo. There are tools now like AI that can get rid of noise, and they're phenomenal. But that's just more work on the backside. Do it right in the start. Try and find an ISO that works best for your camera, and then set an upper limit for that. Okay, and then the last part of this for exposure, like we talked about, is shutter speed, right? So shutter speed is the amount of time that the camera shutter is open to let light in. So it's like blinking your eyes. A quick blink, you're going to get a little bit of light in. A long blink, you're going to let a lot of light in. A fast shutter speed, something like a 1/1000th on the far right here, is going to freeze motion. So for sports and action photography, you want a high shutter speed, or for drone mapping, because the drone is constantly moving while you're taking pictures. A slow shutter speed, like 1 second or a half second, or anything under like 1/60th a second is considered a slow shutter speed, is going to create a motion blur, right? There's going to be blur in the image because you've got, just like imagine those light painting photos. It's a long shutter speed and the point of light is moving around the image. It's recording everything from start to finish. So that's not going to be sharp. It's going to be blurry.
Yeah, like if you've ever seen a photo of a city where like the car, you can see like the headlights of the cars, that's like a long exposure.
Exactly. That's probably like a 1 or 2 second exposure.
Something like that, yeah.
It's basically the sensor is on the entire time and then off, right? So instead of being completely exposed in a microsecond. So adjusting shutter speed is going to change how the movement in your image looks, in addition to also longer shutter equals more light. So it's a balance. This balance is summarized in the exposure triangle. So the triangle is a three-way relationship between shutter speed, ISO, and aperture, right? So if you increase one and decrease the other, you're going to have to balance it out, right? If you add more aperture, you might, in order for the exposure to stay the same, it's a combination lock of 3 different tumblers, right? You increase your aperture, you're going to have to pull back your ISO sensitivity. Maybe your ISO is locked. Now you got to increase your shutter speed. Well, maybe your shutter speed, you don't want it to be. So now you got to look at, if you can't make it work inside those triangles, that's where external things like the ND filters, which are just basically dark sunglasses for your camera, help reduce that light or increase that light. How do you know if your image is exposed or not? Well, there's one tool that pretty much every digital camera now has built into it, and it's called the histogram. And if you took stats, you'll recognize this. It's a horizontal plot by number and location. So what you're looking at is on the left side of the histogram is pure black or zero RGB value, like it's black. There's no data. So if the pixels were all on the left side, it's clipping to black or there's nothing. On the right side is pure white. So it's full value of the sensors, right? You're just blasting full red, full green, and full blue. Like digital camera sensors are RGB, red, green, blue. So you've got full values at that level. And then in between, you've got the midtones. Now, there's different schools of thought and there's different reasons to shoot different photos in different levels, but for the simplification purpose, the best is to target the midtones with the majority of your pixels. So if the curve looked like a triangle or peaked in the center like a bell curve, you'd have a very gray, very low contrast photo, right? It'd be like taking a picture of fog. And then, of course, blacks and whites start to push the pixels out into the shadows, the blacks, and the highlights and the whites. So when you look at these three on here, you've got one to the left that's underexposed, one that's mostly neutral, and there's probably like a strong presence of a black something in there. So that's probably a pretty normal exposure. And then something that's kind of overexposed, right? So there's a highlights of a sky or something in the back. Let's see this in practice now. All right, so this is a straight out of the camera. This was shot with a Mavic 3 in downtown Vancouver. It was a shot for Vancouver House, or sorry, is that the
Covenant House?
No, the other one, the Vancouver House, not Covenant. The new tower. And on the right side, you've got the histogram. And you can see the histogram is U-shaped. So you've got lots of pixels in the darks and lots of pixels in the highlights and really nothing in the middle. And it's represented on this graph in colors as well. So you can see where the blues, greens, and reds are separately. This is an Adobe Camera Raw. The image, right, you've got lots of shadows in the foreground and lots of highlights because it's backlit from the sun behind the building. So the sky is a bit blown out around the building. Let's mess with this image, and all we're going to do is change the exposure value because the image has already been taken, but because it's raw, we can mess with the image. So here is the image with -3 exposure value or 3 full stops of exposure taken out of it. Now the sky is neutrally exposed, right? You've got a nice blue sky. It's a little dark, but you can see that the blues are sitting basically right in the middle of the exposure, but everything else is falling into shadows and clipping into black. So you can see this white triangle on the top left here. That means it's clipping, that there's an abundance of pixels that have nothing at all. And they're down here. There's going to be, if you were to print this, the printer would just be puking out black ink, right? So that's what that means when it's clipping. So it's underexposed. Let's do the reverse. So let's take that same image and do +3. Now you see all the shadows are more or less neutrally exposed. They're fine, but the highlights here where the sun, anywhere the sun hit is overexposed. And then of course the sky, because it's refracting all the light from the sun behind the building, even though you can't see it, sky still refracts light because it's the sun hitting oxygen in the sky. Well, science. It's overexposed, right? So the sky is overexposed because the sun is there and we've pushed it. Now, the cool thing, like I said about RAW has incredible flexibility. And you should always, if you're doing still photography, shoot in RAW because you're getting the raw data out of the camera and you get some latitude. This is the exact same image. You'll notice it had like the ISO was at 100, the aperture was at f7.1, and the shutter was at 130, 320. That stayed the same for all of these images. All we did now is we said, okay, let Photoshop's Camera Raw algorithm figure out what they can fix. And it said, without doing any kind of, like there's other more advanced stuff like masking and gradients and everything else. This RAW, I think, is a 12-bit file. So that means that there's, for every pixel, there's 2 to the power of 12 levels of exposure stored for it. So, and then like JPEGs only have 2 to the power of 8. So there's way more information in the file than what's actually being shown on your screen. So it can reach out beyond what you can see and pull that back in. And so what it's done for every pixel here, it says, okay, I like the highlights here, I like the shadows here, and it's pulled the exposure slightly. So it's only slightly increased the exposure, but it has completely crushed the highlights. It's brought it back, minus 84. And it's pushed the shadows, so all the foreground is being brought up to plus 63. And then the whites, which is the bright whites, it's actually increased them a little bit. And the blacks, it's actually made them blacker a little bit. And it's created this neutral. And on the left, you can see what the original exposure curve of the histogram looked like. And then here's the histogram for the right. So like I said, we've got a lot of technical things. And of course, like the great thing is this is being recorded. So you'll be able to go back and play. And this is meant to be as fast as possible. But to start things off, shoot everything in auto. But what I want you to start thinking about as a drone photographer is understand what the relationship between each of these is so that you can start thinking about, well, I want this to be slightly darker. How can I do that? Well, in auto, I can just say, shoot everything at +1 EV for brighter or -1 EV for darker, because if I'm aiming the camera at the ground, it might overexpose everything because the ground is darker than the sky. So it might affect it. The beauty of shooting it in RAW, you can then dump it into programs like Photoshop. There are free camera raw editing tools out there as well, that you can then build a beautiful JPEG from the original RAW file. So the only expense is slightly bigger memory cards. So,
and now that we're shooting everything digitally and we don't have film to worry about, you can experiment. Take the same shot,
over and over.
Take the same shot, change the f-stop. Take the shot again, change the f-stop, and take 20 of the same shots and then look at it and say, oh, well, that one's the one I like the best. And then you know, so then in the future when you're going out for a client, you can say, okay, in this scenario, I liked f5 the best or whatever.
Yeah. And that's a good point to bring up. So if your camera has a variable aperture, most camera lenses have a sweet spot for sharpness. And it's, again, usually in the middle. So if it's an f2.8 lens, you might want to shoot at f5.6 or f4 because, and there's charts out there, manufacturers, when they sell you a lens, they'll give you something called an MTF chart. And it'll have a curve that shows you the relative overall image sharpness for the entirety of the image. And usually 5.6, like the middle of the road, is where it's sharpest. They optimize the lens for middle exposure. Everything's a compromise one way or another. If you shoot at f22 because you want everything to be super sharp on full super depth of field, you're going to get something called flaring. So you get like halos and stuff around the image. And if you shoot at wide open, it might be either really soft, or you'll get, if you're shooting high contrast, like black and white stuff, you'll get purple and green fringes all over it. It's called chromatic aberration. So there's lots of little optical reasons. Like there's reasons that some camera lenses cost hundreds of thousands of dollars because they've put a lot of science into just the chemistry of the glass, let alone how it's physically built to make it as clean as possible.
My camera, the lens costs more than the body of the camera.
Oh yeah, that's typical. And glass is investment pieces, right? We're in a weird spot in digital camera world where like every camera system's changing lenses. Like Canon just changed after 60 years, I think it was. Sony changed, Nikon changed. Everyone's gone to the new mirrorless system, so there's new cameras. Like I've got lenses that are almost 100 years old that you can get adapters, but you can invest in a piece of glass and it'll last you forever.
All of my mom's Nikons from the 90s, all of her Nikon lenses, they still fit on my Nikon. But she wanted to move to mirrorless, so now she has a Fujifilm.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's always a good reason to switch teams as well as like when you're doing a glass change. Okay. Let me just make sure we haven't completely sunk everyone here. Sorry. It is a technical topic, and the goal of all of these is to build on this. So like next week we're going to be talking about video. We're not going to be talking about aperture and shutter speed. No. Except for one or two things. But
and even right now we're about to move into the vibes section of the talk.
All right, so it's Finn's turn.
It's time for some vibes.
Finn time.
So we're going to talk a little bit about composition. Before I kind of break down some compositional aspects, I just want to talk about a couple things. The first are shots from drones. So, if you're shooting with a camera, most of the time you're standing there holding the camera, and you can kind of more easily manipulate or change the shot. In drones, there are kind of 3 major shots for photography. That's a low oblique, a high oblique, and a nadir shot. Low obliques and high obliques, this is just a shot from the side, but you're above the subject because you're in an aircraft. And then the nadir shot, you're directly on top of the subject shooting straight down. So you can kind of see there in the nadir, this aircraft is shooting straight down 90 degrees. The other thing I kind of want to just mention before we get into this is subject. So when you're looking, I'm going to show you some photos, some drone photos, and I want you to just kind of keep in mind the subject. When I talk about the subject of the photo, this is kind of the main portion of the photo. Sometimes photos have multiple subjects, sometimes photos have no subjects, but if I'm taking a picture of a house, the house is the subject. And now why am I mentioning the subject? Well, we're going to talk about composition. Composition is where you place the subject within the photo to draw the viewer's eye to that subject. So if we advance here are some examples of composition. So these are locations or aspects of a photo that you can highlight to draw the viewer's eye to the subject of the photo. So the most common one that you'll find is the rule of thirds, which is where you have lines like that, and you put the subject on one of those third lines. You can also put it in what's called the golden spiral or the golden ratio. This is a section of the photo that is supposed to mathematically be
pleasing
to the eye. There are other things that you can do. So you see the S curve or the L shape, like using the features of the photo, like either of the terrain or of a piece of infrastructure or built environment to draw the viewer's eye through the photo. This sounds a little bit like kind of art school, but trust me, when I show you some photos, it's going to look pretty clear. Here are some other ones as well. You can see golden ratio again, cross, the golden triangle. This is literally just like putting it in one side of the photo. Radiating, this is this is the railroad tracks going all the way to the horizon, that sort of thing.
It's a forced perspective, well, not forced perspective, but leading lines into a perspective point.
Exactly. So what does this look like in practice? Well, here is a photo, and you can look, this is a pretty nice photo. There's actually a number of compositional aspects to this photo. The first one you can see is the road. The road kind of originally will draw your eye up towards the sky, and then you see the dark clouds. If you head to the next slide, you'll see that I've drawn some lines in it, and you can see this photo follows the rule of thirds.
Yeah.
Pretty simple. But this is a photo taken from the ground. So what does that look like when it's taken from the air? So here is kind of what sets drone photography apart. It's the difference in perspective. Oblique and nadir shots are new, relatively speaking. They're a newer shot, and they can be quite interesting because it's a perspective that people don't always get. That shot along the road, if I was standing on that road, I could see the shot. But if I was above that road in a drone, a person couldn't just see that without the aircraft. Mm-hmm. So in general, in a nadir shot, you will most likely be taking a photo of something to draw the eye through. So either a piece of terrain, a road, a line. And I'll show you some examples of that coming up.
And just to reiterate, there's one of the competitions out there, I see lots of Facebook posts, or you call it Top Down Tuesday, right? So it's try and just compose your image using only nadir or top-down photos, right? So you basically become the photocopier in the sky.
Exactly. And it can be quite effective.
Yeah.
And I'll show you some ones that I thought were cool.
Yeah, so here we go.
So here's some. So here you can see this one's pretty easy to kind of figure out what the subject of the photo is. The subject of and I didn't even realize it when I saw this. There is a cyclist on that road.
And it's perfectly centered.
And it's perfectly centered. So the road is here to draw your eye through the photo. I would look at this photo from left to right and see the terrain features and then the cyclist.
Yeah.
And if you hit the button, you'll see I kind of highlighted the road, which was probably unnecessary. But
there's that S-type composition.
It's like an S-type composition.
Or snake type.
Mm-hmm. You can think of the line through the photo as almost the story of the photo. So this is that really famous road in San Francisco that's extremely tight.
What is it?
I don't remember the name of the road.
Never heard of it before.
Oh, it's super famous.
Could it be Lombard Street?
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay. I have a geography degree. Anyways, this road is super steep and super tight and curvy, and you can see as you go through, you can watch all the cars drive down the road and see all the buildings around it.
The cool thing about this also, if you think about it, for the people that don't know, Lombard Street is like a 45-degree road down the hill. So with nadir photography, you're top down, you have no idea other than the fact that the road seems to get smaller at the end.
And even in this, like on first glance, it looks like a flat road, and then you wonder why is this road
so special.
So special.
Was the paver drunk or something? So perspective changes everything, right? Is probably.
I feel like too these images look so busy, but from the top up, like from the top down, it just kind of all comes together. Whereas if you were to take this just standing, it would just be so much
boring.
to look at.
Yeah.
Like you get so much more.
Yeah, it's that different perspective, the different composition. Here's another one that again, same vibe that you're talking about. Like, how would that look from the side?
It would just look like a bunch of people in a crosswalk, but because it's got the lines that kind of draw back and forth your eye. And this is an example of a photo with multiple subjects, because you could argue that any of these groups of people is the subject of the photo. But so you could either say it's a multi-subject photo or a no-subject photo.
Like an urban landscape.
Here is this would be a high oblique shot, and you can. It's hard to kind of pick out all of the lines that are in this, but I have picked out the lines, and you can actually see that there are a number of diagonal lines to draw your eye from through the photo.
And the light exposure. You can see how the light falls into the lower left third of the image. So you got the most sun falling into that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So in case you're wondering, these photos are from an online service called Unsplash that provides free photos for stock photos for sharing. So we are using these legally. And then this one, you can see the road creates kind of this T or this cross in the middle of the photo so it draws your eye to the center of the photo, and then as you're looking at the photo, you would kind of look out towards the rest of the city. This is another example of a high oblique shot. So it's not directly on top, but it's almost directly on top.
Exactly. Okay, so we did have a question slide, and we're going to ignore that because we got some more. So what the next segment was, I wanted to kind of show some real-world examples. So one of the things that most drone entrepreneurs are going to get into with photography is going to be drone real estate, right? So let's look at some images, and let's talk about the images and kind of see where we've got some strengths and some weaknesses, and then see some other examples. So I have no idea. I just grabbed this image off Google for editorial purposes, so don't at me. But the point is, this is an image that was a drone real estate photography image as an example. I personally don't think it's a very strong image. It serves a purpose, but it's definitely not what we could consider like a fine art photo, for one thing. It's a commercial photo that serves a purpose. When we were looking at this, the reason I chose this photo as a not so great example, and you'll see why in a second, you look at the exposure of the image and you look at the framing, and it's got an obvious subject to the image, but the way the sky is composed in the image is a little too, it feels claustrophobic to me, right? It's pretty high up. The framing of the house is looking out of the frame. It's looking off to the left. It's not square to the camera. It's not something that feels like you're looking at the house from a welcoming perspective. So you feel like an outsider to the image. And then there's some noise on the side. Like you've got trees on the left side and then trees that are intruding into this on the right side. And one of the things with real estate is like, it's very important that you do not edit or manipulate the photos. They have to be as captured. But if this were a fine art photo, I'd probably kill that tree in the bottom and make it more of like an open grass, or make it feel like the house is standing on a hill. So here's another drone image.
Just one more thing about that one. So you say not to edit it too much, and then, but I look at this photo and I think that this photo is oversaturated.
Yes,
so oversaturated
right.
is a photography term when the colors are too colorful. So you look at the grass and you look at the sky, and I think to myself, grass isn't really that green and sky isn't really that blue. So the colors have been turned up a little bit.
Yeah.
One of the ways you can tell if a photo is overexposed is you look at the different foliage, and if they all appear a similar shade of green, that is a clue that it has been overexposed. So
Yeah.
if you look at the trees in the background, those are all different types of trees, and they all look kind of the same green.
Yeah. Yeah, they've been painted with a color brush.
They've been painted green in post. One thing I want to note about this photo, so for my eye, now I don't know the pilot, you don't know the pilot, we don't know how they took it. To me, this looks like that the pilot framed the photo on the screen of the aircraft and then hit the button instead of zooming out a little bit and then editing it in post. So you don't have to do all your framing on the control screen. You have a little bit of leeway after. This is like a common thing that people get into trouble with when they're first starting out with photography, is they think that everything has to be done in the viewfinder or on the screen instead of taking it a little bit more zoomed out so you have a little bit more information on the sides and then cropping it down a little bit.
Yeah, if you've got the megapixels to work with. Right? Jen, you were going to say something?
Oh no, I just I'm listening to you guys and it's all very educational. Like to me, right off the bat as a newbie, I look at that and I don't see a lot wrong with it. But now that you're pointing out these things, but I guess like this might be a silly question, but like at what point do you know you've taken a nice photo? Like, it's so hard to like
consistency.
I guess
right?
like listening to all of this and then you put it all into play. But I mean, it's so subjective. Like the things that you guys are seeing are not the thing that I saw right off the bat.
Yeah, when the buyer of this photo was probably perfectly happy, right? Because that's the thing. This is the purpose of this is to document the house and show the house and sell the house. But the reason I'm bringing it up and things like this is, would it stop the scroll, right? If I were looking for a house, would it stand out amongst the noise? And that's where I want to go to the next one and then the one after, because you look at this one now. Right away, we look at the sky. This one's also a little oversaturated, a little cooked, right? But the things, there's more contrast in this photo. It's backlit. It's got shadows. The shadows have been brought up. Like you can see the house, everything's really flat and really neutral. So again, it's documenting the house as is. But it's clear to me, like the way the house is, the grass looks a little more natural. There's still some brown in the grass. The trees, same thing, like they're a little HDR-y, right? So they've been, remember that effect? Like everyone was just pumping way too unrealistic colors into it. It was a bit of a phase. This has that kind of look to it. Now, this one would stop the scroll to me a little bit more if I'm just going through a gallery of houses and shopping. But the next set of images, this is where you don't have to shoot all your photos in the middle of the day for real estate. Let's start playing with light. So the next three images here were shot by a friend of mine in Victoria, Matthew Newman. He does real estate photography with drones and terrestrial cameras. He's a trained photographer, like went to school and everything way before this. He actually started in rock band photography. So, but it's funny. I let him know. I'm like, oh, by the way, I'm stealing some of your photos for this today. And this one, the reason I grabbed this one is it's just off his Instagram feed, and it stood out to me right away because it's a photo that could easily either be with a drone or with a camera pole. Days before drones, they just use fixed poles. It doesn't need to be up at 400 feet. This photo was probably shot at 60, 70 feet, right? The house is only a 2-story house, couldn't be that tall. And this was shot with a Mini 3 Pro. All that technical stuff doesn't really matter. Like most of these drones can take pretty phenomenal photos. All Matt would have done is shot this in RAW with a slightly longer exposure or possibly multiple exposures and then edited them together in post, like using Lightroom or some other photo editing software. But twilight photos, for example, are going to show that contrast and show what the house really looks like when you live in it. Like you go to work in the morning, it's dark. You come home at night, it's dark. What does your house look like in the dark? I don't really care what it looks like at noon. I'm not looking at my house at noon. I'm either inside watching TV or outside mowing the lawn or gone doing something, right? So I don't really care what my house looks like during the day. That's the most boring lighting that a house can be. It's when you come home or when you leave is what are you coming home to? And that's, I think, what his motive with this is. So here's a couple more. And this is, again, going back into composition. This shot was only about 15 feet off the ground. I think this was with Mavic 3. And the only reason he uses a drone in this situation is because if he had shot it, he's about 6 feet tall at eye level, he would all of these brush down below here would have obscured the house. You'd have an unclear. So, And Matt's also in architecture photography. He's got a background in that. And one of the important things to look at is look at the lines. They're all parallel, right? So vertical lines should be parallel on a house. And you can either do that through distortion correction or through proper positioning of your camera. If you have a wide angle lens, which all drones pretty much are, it's very important to make sure that your camera isn't tilted at a certain oblique.
And I'm just going to stand up and point something out. If it's too quiet, Ian can relay. 1/3, 2/3, third.
Yeah.
And then this vertical line is in the third.
So if you got that, it's you've got a third across the top, a third across the bottom, and they're very strong. And then you've got a vertical for where, so your eye is immediately drawn to the center right of the image, right? So you've got that third composition, that's the beauty shot of this house. Same property. Now you've got the left side with the entrance in 1/3 and the other semi-entrance or garage type on the right side. This is the back side of the house, so it's not as, I don't really know if this is the back or the front, but it's a weird house. But of course, this thing's probably like $8 million.
Yeah.
It's a different house. Is it a different house? No, it's the same house.
No, it's not weird. It's different.
It's a different house, yeah. But same thing. You've got strong rule of third composition. You've got leading lines. So all lines are parallel or the perspective isn't distorted. And then all vertical lines are straight up and down. That's something that's really big in any architecture photography, to the point where he actually has special lenses when he's doing ground-based. They're called tilt shift lenses, where it shifts the lens vertically or horizontally to adjust or force the perspective. You can do that in software to some extent these days. It's actually really amazing what it can do. But again, instead of having to shift the lens, you can physically move your drone. Like you've got unlimited 3D space to move your drone. All of these shots though were under, like this is below the roof line of the house. No one cares what the roof looks like. You can't see the roof when you drive home every day. So why would you care what it looks like other than if you've got garbage on the roof? So here's some more not so strong images. Why do we or don't we like this image?
So Ian and I looked at this image, so we'll ask Jenn. Jenn, which house are they trying to sell in this photo?
It's probably all of them, you know. It's a group. Yeah, it's a group of friends. Well, yeah, that. I mean, this is just. I think I keep using the word busy because that's the only way I can personally describe some of these photos. But it just looks busy to me without really giving my attention to anything. I guess now that we're talking, I feel like if you're selling the area, I mean, you're kind of focusing the left side a lot on the trees behind the buildings.
By green space.
Yeah.
That was the same thing I thought. I'm like, okay, I get it. Like, I really don't like the photo from a technical perspective, but okay, you're showing
the idea, I guess.
Like, yeah, you're backed on green space and all your neighbors have relatively clean yards. No one's got like a beat up old pickup truck rotting in the backyard or something or like, but there's privacy concerns also for real estate photography. So you shouldn't really be showing your neighbors' properties in real estate. It's bad form and potentially, like if you're showing identifying things and this is a commercial work, there's legal limitations of that from privacy as well. So better image. Two things. They've used a low sun angle, and this is funny. Yesterday when Finn and I were talking, I'm like, they shot this at either sunset or sunrise, so they've got a super low sun angle. You can see the shadows from all the trees. Initially, I hated it. Now, I'm like, wow, it adds texture and contrast to the image, so it's more visually appealing. It shows depth, and you like the roof lines, like the houses are showing better. So it's probably better, but again, it's just something that's important, right?
Yeah, but it's just so funny how like those two images can be very similar, but I guess it just takes time and energy to put into different pictures and look at them separately. But
what I really like about this image though is it still shows that you're in a nice green, quiet, treed neighborhood, but it's got a lot of symmetry to it, right? So you've got that teardrop kind of symmetry, and there's that 45-degree line that's going up the center of it. So it's showing, I live in a really nice neighborhood. Again, this would be one of many photos in a set that I would deliver to a customer, but it wouldn't be the hero image. This would probably be the last image you'd want.
It shows you which neighbors you want to be friends with, though. The guy with the pool, obviously, you're
everyone's
gonna.
got a pool.
Yeah, you're gonna pick some good neighbors to be around.
Here's another entirely different property, but again, this is a really strong top-down photo for real estate. It shows the entire property and only the property. You can see you've got water, you've got a moorage for your boat, you've got this massive pool, massive house. There's a car to give you a sense of scale. If you didn't have a car or a boat in there, you wouldn't really know. It could be a 500 square foot shed that's been built to look like a McMansion or something. So
The one thing I wanted to note about this photo compared to the other one, so this photo is a little bit more, to my eye, a little bit more interesting.
Yeah.
And that's just because it's a more interesting subject. It's a better house to shoot.
yeah,
You're not always going to get the greatest subject in the world to shoot. Sometimes you'll get hired to shoot a house and it's a cookie cutter suburban house that's gray.
well, like row houses and townhouses. Like, are you going to use a drone for a row house and a townhouse? Maybe 1 or 2 photos to establish, but you're going to be pulling out the camera and the tripod to do most of your work.
But sometimes you get something like this with a really interesting pool backed up on the water that, you know, you've got a better subject to shoot, a more interesting subject to shoot.
Your drone pilot photographer training has become fully realized.
Yes.
Okay, so in chat, Maya asked if we could suggest some free programs real quick.
Yes. So the one that I would use, Lightroom. So Lightroom is a paid software, except for the mobile version. The mobile version is free and is fully featured. So
Almost
Almost
There's a
fully featured.
subscription paywall for like masking and all the advanced stuff.
Okay, I've never used the masking, so
Okay.
all of the basic features that you need are on the mobile version. So you can
iPad, right?
use an iPad, or you could use your phone. Every photo that I post on Instagram, I take it with my phone in RAW, bump it into Lightroom, edit the photo, export it.
Perfect.
You could just pop your drone photos onto Google Drive, download them onto your phone or iPad, and then do it like that.
Other free one is GIMP, G-I-M-P. It's a open source equivalent of Photoshop. Adobe has a paid subscription. It's pretty affordable. It used to be, I think it's still $7 to $10 per month, and it includes both Photoshop, Creative Cloud, and Lightroom. And secret tip, Photoshop can actually be used to edit video as well. It's got a video editor. It's not nearly as good as like Resolve or Premiere, but you can drop video into it and do timeline editing. So if you're a drone shooter and you just want to have like a really basic suite for a commercial, again, if you're running a business, it's a write-off. What's a write-off? I don't know. We'll put some more free ones in the community thread chat about the notes here. And if you guys have any that you've used in the past, I've been using Lightroom forever, and it's a really good program. Yeah, it costs money, but it's paid for itself over the years, one way or another. Finally, I want to, like, from the fine art world side of it, of course, I asked ChatGPT to give me some recommendations, and my favorite photographer was number 1 on ChatGPT, so that invigorates my confidence in AI. But one of the most notable drone photographers, and he's Canadian, is Edward Bertinsky. He's from St. Catharines, Ontario. And if you've ever seen or haven't yet, you should check out the documentary called Manufactured Landscapes. It features him following around industrial urban landscapes and environments and talking about just the industrialization and the impact on the land and our landscape. He has been using aerial photography first with like skyjackers or lifts or like blimps or cranes or planes or whatever. And more recently, he did the Three Gorges Dam in like 2006 or 2007 using this massive Matrice-sized drone with he almost exclusively, well, I'm not sure now, but he used to only shoot in large format cameras. So 4x6, 4x5, or 8x10 sized film plates. And then his work is featured in the National Gallery of Canada, for example. Most of his prints are like 12 by 12 feet or larger. They are massive, and the level of detail is just phenomenal. So on the left side here, I think that's a tailing pond, and the right as well. He did a series on oil in both the oil sands and also down in California, and like the work is phenomenal. I was really fortunate to see a couple of his galleries, and I'm getting all worked up about it now. But anyway, that's my jam. And also another one is Paul Nicklin. I don't know much about Paul Nicklin. He was a recommended second. His work obviously looks similar in some ways. I'm going to go and take a look at more of it, but he's from Baffin Island, Nunavut. He's a wildlife and nature photographer. He's done quite a bit of work for National Geographic, and he's known for his intimate portrayal of isolated and endangered habitats. So a bit of a theme. I do have more. I'll share them in the community notes in the chat with this after the fact, but that is it for the screen share. And we've got 4 minutes before we get the boot. So if anyone had any questions, now is the time.
Just wanted to say it's very informative. It was a good session. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Maya. And obviously, like, we've got a Photo Pro course. One of our goals this year is to update it. A lot of this content is going to find its way in there in a more polished format. So so next week is going to be videography with drones. So we're going to build on what we've talked about, exposure and composition and framing, and we're going to add motion to it. We're going to try and keep it simple, and we'll try not to involve too much in terms of camera movement. So not pan left, tilt up, tilt down, push, like all the terrible terms that people use for moving a camera. We'll try and get that right. But I think the first focus is going to be on just motion, right? So same shots with motion. And we'll get into like video formats and why you should shoot and what you should. A little bit more about what gear you need for those shots. And then after that, we'll follow on with how do you move the camera. Okay. So thanks so much for everyone that dropped in this week. It's great to have an audience, and we're so happy to see you.
Just one last thought. So we talk about all these rules for photography. If the photo looks good, it's a good photo.
Exactly. That's yes.
That's what we needed to hear, us newbies. Hey, just take the photo. Yeah, just take it, see what happens.
No one is going to be your harshest critic other than yourself.
And Ian. Ian will be a critic as well.
Yeah. No,
supportive, but
yeah.
But yeah.
Well, my wife is also a photographer, and we met through photography. And like the first 2 weeks of us dating, I convinced her to stop shooting in JPEG and start shooting in RAW. And basically, my courting her was telling her how bad her photography was.
Classic.
And now we have 2 kids, and we just celebrated our 10th wedding anniversary.
Oh, so, congratulations. Yeah. That's amazing.
All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks.